Thank you. I'm delighted to be here with everybody. Can you all hear me all right? And is my image up? It is. Good. So I'm going to preface what I have to say about where my Armageddon was by saying that as far as why it's hard to get the message out, I don't think there's any mystery to it. They have deliberately defunded art since at least 1989. I think that was very deliberate because artists do have a voice. We do get attention. We do have a visceral impact. Better to shut us up. How easier to shut us up than make sure we have no money and can't support ourselves. And then we go crazy trying to support ourselves in other ways, and then there's no time to make those visceral images or products that could make a difference. There's actually, according to the Center for Climate Change Communication, there's actually only 17% of the American public that disbelieves in climate change, and they cannot be reached by any argument. However, if you present them with a profit motive, they will do anything you want. So what's really important is to reach all the rest. That's my math is not too good either. So that's 83%. Now, what we have to remember is there are way more of us than there are of them. No matter how smart they think they are, no matter how much money the Koch brothers throw at it, and as of last count, it was going to be $900 million they were going to throw at the 2016 election. So we'll find out just how smart we are. As an artist, I've always assumed that I had the capacity to model relationships to systems. When I decided to do the GhostNets project, my idea was to create a model that could be replicated by a relatively ordinary person to restore degraded environments. The reason I wanted to do that was because that's one of the best ways to deal with sequestration and to mitigate climate change. When I started the project, I sent out a press release and announced, this is the decade of choice. That was 1990. Well, so much for that choice. It didn't go anywhere. Then from 2000 to 2006, I tried a lot of other things in a project called the Cities and Oceans of If. What if we went around the world and designated areas that could be restored and have bioregional impacts? That was the beginning of something called trigger point theory. The idea that you could identify a very small point in a system that could affect a large system. What turned me to something more activist about climate change specifically was Katrina. I was in Zaragoza, Spain. I was attending the Society for Ecological Restoration International Conference. Katrina hit, and I said to everybody, we've got to put out a letter. We've got to tell them that we have the people here now in Zaragoza who could turn this whole thing around. It was a whole building full of the world's best restorationists. And they said, no, we're not really ready politically. And they didn't. They didn't until about 2 years ago in Mexico. Better late than never. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I do my practice, because I consider my practice performative. It's intended as a whole life experience and as something that might change systems. The image you're looking at was after I went to Zaragoza and came back, one of the things I decided was I was not going to fly, because it seemed ridiculous to me that we had restorationists flying all over the world, emitting carbon emissions all over the waters to restore one small piece of land at a time. I decided I wasn't going to do that. So I started going by train to exhibitions when I could. Honestly, I had to break that when I decided to get a PhD, unfortunately. I had to fly to Switzerland. But in this case, I took the train to Baton Rouge. I took a train to Baton Rouge to go to a conference on deltaic systems. I specifically went during hurricane season. I wanted to track through the train window what I was seeing of how the country was changing. And one of the things I saw as we came into the bayous was what has happened to the bayous. Later, I worked on that image and digitized it, and this is called the red sky. There was a whole series of other images that came out of that were called oil and water, about how we generate that wonderful red sky and the black waters that we're now seeing all over the earth. One of the ways I digitized it was not just in Photoshop. I started doing a series of webcasts, which are mentioned in my biography, called Gulf to Gulf. I started working in 2007 with Dr. Jim White, who's the director of Instar. You probably know him. You're nodding your head. He's a great guy. And we started doing a series of webcasts about how an artist and a scientist might conceive of how to deal with climate change. We've been doing them ever since. In 2009, we started including Dr. Gene Turner from Louisiana State University, who's one of the world's experts on dead zones. Dead zones, if you're not already aware, is when you get too much nitrates into the water and you basically kill the entire system. What I was really interested in was, how can we put these different ideas together? How can we use webcasts as a point of leverage and the virtual world in general to create another system? So I think we can go to the next image. When Gene joined us and we started talking about dead zones, around 2010 is when people started talking about opening up the Arctic for shipping lanes. And needless to say, we were all utterly horrified. One of the purposes of my making artifacts, the idea was to create mnemonic devices. Artifacts that are not necessarily precious objects in themselves, but foci for meditation. So the red sky that you saw before was one kind of meditation. This is another kind of meditation. The original was created while the three of us were talking about the impacts of opening the Arctic. And you can see that to the left of the Mississippi, we have fires and forest loss. To the right, we have storms and flooding. And they all interact. And the result is basically a dead environment. And you have this little stick on the side, on the right.
The trees and the mountains are cold and bare.
That's what we're doing. Making the whole mountain, the whole earth, cold and bare. But when we kept working with this image, and this particular one, by the way, is in caustic. It was a series that I did. When we started staring at this image, what we saw was that if we looked at the relationship between Iowa, for example, factory farms, and the dead zones, and the Arctic, and off to the right, you can see where the Far Rockaways are, and in the middle of all of that is Memphis. And Memphis was really interesting to me because it seemed to me a point of leverage to restore the entire system. So the three of us went to Memphis. Actually, Jim couldn't come with us, but Gene and I did. We did a series of events, including canoeing the Wolf River. We figured out that if the Wolf River were reconnected to the Mississippi, you'd have what's called flushing. And what flushing does is it allows sedimentation to come into a system, and that's part of what protects any coastal system from flooding. Because they had interrupted where the Wolf River meets the Mississippi, they did have a major flood in 2011. So we figured out that if it were reconnected, that might mitigate some of the flooding in Memphis, and it would also impact the larger bioregion. The other thing that came out of that particular series of events in 2013 was that Jim and I calculated that at that point, if we could restore 36% of the Earth's surface, which theoretically we don't actually have, but if we could, by 2030, we could mitigate climate change. So my mission now is to engage the whole effing world in restoration, which, needless to say, requires a major retooling of how we model our lives. I think we have to move from a few individual artists doing some art of everyday life to the whole world beginning to think that each of us has enormous responsibility to repair what we've done. And how are we going to do that? I think we start with situations like this, with a group of people who are concerned, with scientists and artists, and we start figuring out how we layer the strategies. And there are many strategies. This morning I was working on editing a chapter for a book on soils. And the chapter I'm working on is a conversation with Ray Weil, who's a soil scientist. And he has this great idea for using brassicas, like radishes, to restore the soil. And he's engaged very large factory farms in using this to restore the soil. It's very simple, doesn't require any fertilizers. It's more profitable for them than using nitrates. And in our conversation, we were simply comparing his systemic approach to my own systemic approach. And the way we were able to do this was we just had a couple of conversations in webcasts, got that transcribed. It's going to go in a book. It'll reach a few people. I have to say that I'm not wildly good at marketing. And one reason is that I don't have tons of money and time to spend on that. So I think it's kind of incredible that despite that, these little webcasts that I do have reached 84 countries. So there are ways for this stuff to get out. I think people are actually desperately hungry for real information and real ideas about what can be done. And I'm thrilled to be in a position where I can discuss that in a room like this with all of you.